Captain Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other pilots. While her fellow aviators followed strict formation protocols and adhered to every regulation in the manual, Sarah believed that RAAL flying meant pushing boundaries. Her superiors called it reckless. She called it instinct. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airfield as Sarah walked toward her F-16 Fighting Falcon. The aircraft gleamed in the early light, its sleek frame promising the freedom she craved above the clouds. Today's mission was supposed to be routine, a training exercise over the Nevada desert. Standard formation flying, radio checks, and basic maneuvers. Nothing that should challenge someone with Sarah's skills. Sarah had joined the Air Force 7 years ago, driven by stories her grandfather told about World War II dogfights and the pilots who bent the rules to save lives. She graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy, but her instructors noted something troubling in her files: a tendency to improvise when following orders might have been safer. As she performed her pre-flight checks, Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she'd had with Colonel Martinez the previous week. He'd warned her about her flying style, using words like unpredictable and dangerous. The other pilots respected her skills but whispered about her methods. They said she flew like she was still proving something to herself. The radio crackled to life as her squadron prepared for takeoff. Eagle Flight, this is Tower. You are cleared for departure. Maintain standard formation and follow designated flight path. Roger, Tower, replied squadron leader Captain Davis, a by-the-book pilot who had never met a regulation he didn't love. Eagle Flight departing. Sarah's F-16 roared to life, the massive engine creating a symphony of power beneath her. As they climbed through the clear desert sky, she felt the familiar rush of freedom that only came at 30,000 feet. The world below became a patchwork of brown and gold, stretching endlessly toward distant mountains. 20 minutes into the flight, Sarah noticed something the others had missed. On her radar screen, a small blip appeared and disappeared near the Mexican border. It shouldn't have been there, the area was supposed to be clear of all air traffic. Her training told her to report it to Davis and request permission to investigate. Her instincts told her something else entirely. Eagle 2 breaking formation to investigate possible bogey, she announced over the radio, banking hard to the southeast before anyone could respond. Eagle 2, return to formation immediately. Davis's voice crackled with authority and frustration. That's an order. But Sarah was already diving toward the source of the radar contact, her fighter cutting through the air like a silver arrow. Below, she spotted what appeared to be a small civilian aircraft flying erratically near the border. The plane was too low and moving in patterns that made no sense for normal flight. As she approached, Sarah realized the aircraft was in serious trouble. Black smoke poured from its engine, and it was losing altitude rapidly. Through her canopy, she could see two figures in the cockpit, frantically working their controls. The plane was going down, and there was no suitable landing area for miles. Without hesitation, Sarah switched to the emergency frequency and began coordinating a rescue. She radioed the location to search and rescue teams while maintaining visual contact with the struggling aircraft. When the plane finally crash-landed in a remote canyon, Sarah circled overhead, marking the location and ensuring the survivors could be found quickly. The rescue was successful, but Sarah's unauthorized departure from formation had not gone unnoticed. When she landed back at base 2 hours later, Colonel Martinez was waiting on the tarmac with a grim expression. "Captain Mitchell, report to my office immediately," he said as she climbed down from her aircraft. The debriefing was swift and decisive. Despite the successful rescue, Sarah had violated direct orders and endangered her squadron by breaking formation without authorization. The book was clear: pilots who couldn't follow orders were pilots who got people killed. "Captain, your actions today showed a complete disregard for military protocol," Colonel Martinez said, his weathered face stern behind his desk. "Yes, you helped save 2 lives. But you also put your squadron at risk and disobeyed a direct order from your flight leader." Sarah stood at attention, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. She had saved lives, but, in the military's eyes, she had also proven that she couldn't be trusted to follow orders when it mattered most. "You're grounded, Captain. Effective immediately." Report to flight safety for additional training and evaluation. Maybe some time on the ground will help you remember that being part of a team means following the rules that keep everyone safe. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. Flying wasn't just her job, it was who she was. The idea of being stuck on the ground while others took to the skies felt like a death sentence. She had always believed that good pilots trusted their instincts over rigid protocols, but the Air Force clearly disagreed. As she left the colonel's office, Sarah's mind raced with frustration and doubt. The other pilots in the squadron avoided eye contact as she walked through the hangar. Some probably thought she got what she deserved. Others might have understood her choice but wouldn't risk their own careers by showing support. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, staring at photos of her grandfather in his World War II bomber jacket. He had told her stories of pilots who saved entire squadrons by thinking quickly and acting decisively, often against orders. But times had changed, and the modern military demanded strict adherence to chain of command. For the next several weeks, Sarah endured the humiliation of ground duty. She attended safety briefings, filed paperwork, and watched helplessly as her squadron flew missions without her. The flight instructor assigned to her case, Major Thompson, was a former fighter pilot who had been grounded himself years earlier for similar infractions. "You've got excellent instincts, Mitchell," he told her during one of their sessions. "But instincts without discipline get people killed. The military isn't just about individual heroics anymore. It's about precision, coordination, and trust." Sarah nodded but struggled to accept the philosophy. She had seen too many situations where following orders blindly would have led to disaster. The rescue she had performed proved that sometimes breaking the rules was the right thing to do, even if the system couldn't acknowledge it. Meanwhile, tensions in Eastern Europe were escalating. News reports spoke of increasing military activity along disputed borders, and Sarah knew her squadron would likely be deployed soon. The thought of missing a real combat mission because of her grounding was almost unbearable. 3 weeks into her punishment, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hayes, a decorated combat veteran and one of the highest-ranking female officers in the Air Force, sat across from her in the small conference room. "Captain Mitchell, I've been reviewing your file," the general said, her voice measured and thoughtful. "Your record shows exceptional flying skills combined with a troubling pattern of insubordination." Sarah waited, unsure whether this meeting would extend her grounding or offer some path back to active duty. "I knew your grandfather," General Hayes continued, surprising Sarah. "He was my instructor when I was a young lieutenant. He told me something I've never forgotten: the best pilots know when to follow orders and when to trust their hearts. The trick is learning the difference." The general stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the flight line where Sarah's F-16 sat covered and unused. "There's a situation developing overseas that might require someone with your particular combination of skills and flexibility. But first, you need to prove you can be trusted to make the right decisions under pressure." As General Hayes left, Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time since her grounding began. She didn't know what situation the general was referring to, but she sensed that her chance for redemption might be closer than she had imagined. That night, Sarah called her grandfather, now in his 90s but still sharp as ever. When she told him about her grounding and the general's cryptic words, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, girl, sometimes the military has to break you down before it can build you back up into the pilot they really need. Your time will come, and when it does, you'll know exactly what to do." His words stayed with her as she continued her ground training, working harder than ever to prove she could balance her instincts with military discipline. She studied tactical manuals, practiced formation flying in simulators, and listened carefully to every piece of advice Major Thompson offered. Unknown to Sarah, General Hayes was indeed monitoring her progress closely. Reports from Major Thompson indicated that the captain was learning to channel her natural flying instincts within proper military frameworks. More importantly, she was developing the judgment to know when rules should be followed absolutely and when they might need to be bent for the greater good. The situation overseas continued to deteriorate, and classified reports spoke of increasing risks to American personnel in combat zones. Sarah sensed that something significant was building, but her security clearance had been temporarily suspended during her grounding, leaving her in the dark about specific developments. As her fourth week of ground duty ended, Sarah received orders to report to General Hayes's office the following morning. Major Thompson's final evaluation had been submitted, and her fate would soon be decided. Whether she would return to active flying status or face further discipline remained unclear. Walking across the base that evening, Sarah watched as her squadron prepared for another training mission. The sight of their F-16s taxiing toward the runway filled her with longing and determination. Tomorrow would bring answers, and she prayed that her weeks of ground training had proven her worthiness to return to the sky. The desert sunset painted the base in golden hues as Sarah stood at attention outside the hangar, watching her fellow pilots disappear into the distance. Soon, she hoped, she would join them again, this time as a pilot who understood both the value of following orders and the courage required to make difficult decisions when lives hung in the balance. The morning arrived with an urgency that Sarah felt even before she opened her eyes. Something in the air at the base had changed overnight. Personnel moved with sharper purpose, and the usual casual conversations between shifts had been replaced by hushed, serious discussions. General Hayes's office was located in the most secure section of the base, requiring multiple security checks and clearances. As Sarah approached the building, she noticed increased activity around the command center. Military vehicles came and went with unusual frequency, and communications personnel worked with an intensity that suggested something significant was developing. "Captain Mitchell reporting as ordered, ma'am," Sarah said as she stood at attention before the general's desk. General Hayes looked up from a stack of classified documents, her expression grave but not unsympathetic. Behind her, wall-mounted displays showed maps of Eastern Europe with various markers and notations that Sarah couldn't quite make out from her position. "At ease, Captain. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss." Sarah took the offered chair, noticing that General Hayes seemed to be weighing her words carefully. The room felt charged with the kind of tension that preceded important decisions. "Your ground training evaluation has been completed," the general began. "Major Thompson reports that you've shown significant improvement in following protocols while maintaining your natural flying instincts. More importantly, you've demonstrated better judgment about when flexibility is appropriate and when strict adherence to orders is non-negotiable." Sarah remained silent, sensing that this conversation was leading somewhere far more significant than a simple reinstatement to flight status. "However, your return to active duty will not be with your regular squadron," General Hayes continued. "We have a situation that requires someone with your specific combination of skills, experience, and willingness to operate outside standard parameters." The general stood and moved to the wall display, which Sarah could now see showed detailed topographical maps of a mountainous region she didn't immediately recognize. 3 days ago, a joint NATO reconnaissance mission went missing over disputed territory in Eastern Europe. The mission included 2 very high-ranking officers from different NATO member nations, General Marcus Hoffmann from Germany and General Alessandro Rossi from Italy. Both men were conducting a classified assessment of enemy capabilities in the region. Sarah's pulse quickened as the implications became clear. High-ranking generals didn't simply go missing during routine missions. Their aircraft went down in mountainous terrain approximately 60 miles behind enemy lines, General Hayes explained, using a laser pointer to indicate the location on the map. "Intelligence suggests they survived the crash, but enemy forces are conducting an intensive search for them in the same area." The general returned to her desk and opened a thick folder marked with the highest security classifications Sarah had ever seen. Standard rescue protocols would involve a large-scale operation with multiple aircraft and ground support. However, such an operation would likely trigger a significant military escalation in an already volatile region. The political ramifications could be catastrophic. Sarah began to understand why she was sitting in this room instead of facing another disciplinary hearing. What we need is a single pilot capable of operating independently, making split-second decisions without direct oversight, and adapting to rapidly changing circumstances. Someone who has already proven willing to break formation when lives are at stake. The words hung in the air as Sarah processed what was being asked of her. This wasn't just a return to active duty, it was an opportunity to undertake the kind of mission that would either validate everything she believed about flying and decision-making or end her career permanently. "Ma'am, what exactly would this mission entail?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. General Hayes opened another file, revealing photographs of terrain, weather reports, and intelligence assessments. You would fly alone in a modified F-16 equipped for long-range penetration and survival operations. Your mission would be to locate the missing generals, assess their condition, and either extract them directly or coordinate their rescue while evading enemy air defenses and ground forces. The enormity of the task began to sink in. Sarah would be operating completely alone, beyond the reach of normal support structures, in hostile territory where capture would mean not just her own death but potential international incident. The aircraft has been modified with extended fuel tanks, advanced communication equipment, and specialized survival gear. However, once you cross into enemy territory, you'll be entirely on your own. No backup, no cavalry, no second chances. Sarah studied the maps and intelligence reports, her mind already working through potential flight paths, landing sites, and contingency plans. The terrain was challenging, dense forests interspersed with rocky valleys and steep mountainsides. Landing would be extremely difficult, and takeoff might be nearly impossible depending on conditions. "Ma'am, what's the timeline for this mission?" Sarah asked, noting the urgency in everyone's movements around the base. "Intelligence suggests that enemy search teams are closing in on the general's location. Weather reports indicate a storm front moving through the area tomorrow night, which could provide cover for extraction but also make flying conditions extremely dangerous. We have perhaps 18 hours before the window closes." General Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious but respectful. "Captain, I need to be absolutely clear about what I'm asking. This mission has an extremely high probability of failure. You could be shot down, captured, or killed. Even if successful, you'll be operating in violation of several international agreements, and, if discovered, the United States government will officially deny any knowledge of your presence." The general paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Your country needs you to make a choice that goes beyond normal military service. This isn't an order, it's a request. If you decline, you'll be returned to active duty with your regular squadron, and this conversation never happened." Sarah thought about her grandfather's stories of World War II pilots who flew impossible missions to save their fellow soldiers. She remembered the rescue she had performed weeks earlier, breaking formation to save 2 civilians in a crashing aircraft. The principles were the same, but the stakes were now exponentially higher. "Ma'am, I volunteer for the mission," Sarah said without hesitation. General Hayes nodded, though her expression remained grave. "I expected that response, but I needed to hear you say it. From this moment forward, you're officially transferred to a classified special operations unit. Your squadron will be told you've been reassigned for advanced training." The next several hours passed in a blur of intensive briefings. Sarah met with intelligence analysts who provided detailed information about enemy capabilities, terrain specialists who identified potential landing sites, and communications experts who explained the modified equipment in her aircraft. The F-16 she would fly had been extensively modified by technicians working around the clock. Extended fuel tanks increased her range significantly but also made the aircraft heavier and less maneuverable. Specialized communication gear would allow her to contact the generals if they were still mobile, but using it would also risk revealing her position to enemy monitoring stations. Most significantly, the aircraft had been equipped with a terrain-following radar system that would allow her to fly extremely low through mountainous terrain, hopefully avoiding enemy detection. However, this type of flying required absolute precision and left no margin for error. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the mission's intelligence coordinator, provided Sarah with everything known about the missing general's last known location. General Hoffman is 62 years old, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and trained in survival techniques, Dr. Walsh explained. General Rossi is 58, also combat experienced, and speaks multiple languages including Russian, which could be useful for evading capture. The intelligence suggested that both men had survived the crash but were likely injured. Their aircraft had been carrying survival equipment, but they would be facing temperatures below freezing, limited food supplies, and the constant threat of capture. Enemy search patterns suggest they're conducting a systematic sweep of the crash area, Dr. Walsh continued. However, our analysis indicates the generals may have moved to higher ground to improve their chances of radio contact and rescue. Sarah studied detailed photographs of the terrain, memorizing landmarks and potential navigation points. The area was heavily forested with numerous small valleys and ridges that could provide concealment but also made visual navigation extremely challenging. Weather Officer Captain Rodriguez briefed Sarah on the approaching storm system. You'll have a window of approximately 6 hours during the storm when cloud cover will provide concealment from enemy radar, he explained. However, visibility will be near zero, winds will be gusting up to 40 knots, and icing conditions are expected above 8,000 feet. The combination of challenges seemed almost overwhelming, but Sarah found herself energized rather than intimidated. This was exactly the kind of mission she had always imagined herself flying, one where her unconventional instincts and willingness to take calculated risks would be assets rather than liabilities. That afternoon, Sarah conducted multiple practice flights in the modified F-16, familiarizing herself with its altered handling characteristics and new equipment. The additional weight made the aircraft less responsive, and the terrain-following system required complete trust in computerized navigation, something that went against every instinct she had developed as a pilot. During her final practice session, Sarah pushed the aircraft through low-level flight patterns over terrain similar to what she would encounter on the mission. Flying at 200 feet above ground level at high speed required constant attention and split-second reflexes. One moment of inattention could result in flying directly into a mountainside. As evening approached, Sarah attended her final mission briefing. The room included General Hayes, Dr. Walsh, and several other officials whose names and departments weren't revealed to Sarah. Maps covered every wall, and multiple communication stations maintained contact with intelligence assets throughout the region. Latest intelligence indicates enemy forces have expanded their search area, Dr. Walsh reported. They're using helicopters and ground teams with dogs. Time is running out. General Hayes addressed Sarah directly. Captain, your takeoff is scheduled for 0200 hours. You'll fly a northeastern route that takes you through 3 different national airspaces before crossing into the target area. Navigation will be primarily by GPS, but you'll need to maintain complete radio silence until you reach the search zone. Sarah nodded, reviewing her flight plan one final time. The route was designed to minimize detection by following commercial air corridors and terrain features that would mask her radar signature. Once you locate the generals, your primary mission is to establish communication and assess their condition, the general continued. If immediate extraction is possible, you're authorized to attempt landing and rescue. If not, you'll coordinate with a backup extraction team that will move into position outside the target area. The backup plan was necessarily vague, as it would depend entirely on Sarah's assessment of conditions on the ground. She would have to make critical decisions with incomplete information and no opportunity for consultation. As the briefing concluded, General Hayes asked to speak with Sarah privately. Captain, I want you to understand something about this mission, the general said once they were alone. Success or failure will depend entirely on your judgment and instincts. There's no playbook for what you're about to attempt. Trust yourself, but also remember that sometimes the bravest decision is knowing when to abort and try a different approach. Sarah left the briefing room with 4 hours remaining before takeoff. She spent the time reviewing intelligence reports, studying maps, and mentally rehearsing various scenarios she might encounter. The modified F-16 sat in a specially secured hangar, surrounded by technicians making final preparations. As she suited up in her flight gear, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement that preceded every challenging mission. But, this time, the stakes extended far beyond her own survival or career. 2 generals' lives hung in the balance, and the broader implications for international stability made failure unthinkable. Walking toward her aircraft at 0130 hours, Sarah looked up at the star-filled sky and thought about her grandfather's words, the best pilots know when to follow orders and when to trust their hearts. Tonight, she would need to do both. The F-16's engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Sarah felt the aircraft's power vibrating through her body. In 30 minutes, she would be alone over hostile territory, relying on her skills, instincts, and determination to accomplish a mission that would test everything she had learned about flying and decision-making. As she taxied toward the runway, Sarah's radio crackled with final clearance from the control tower. General Hayes's voice came through on a secure channel. "Eagle Solo, you have clearance for departure." "Good hunting, Captain." The runway stretched ahead in the darkness as Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt her modified F-16 accelerate into the night. Behind her lay the safety and structure of military base operations. Ahead lay the unknown challenges of the most important mission of her career. The darkness beyond Sarah's canopy seemed absolute as her F-16 climbed through the night sky. Below, the lights of civilization gradually disappeared, replaced by the empty blackness of rural landscape and distant mountains. Her modified aircraft felt different, heavier, less responsive, but also more purposeful, like a weapon specifically crafted for this singular mission. Navigation during the first phase relied entirely on GPS coordinates and predetermined waypoints that would take her through international airspace while avoiding major air defense installations. Sarah maintained strict radio silence, her presence known only to a handful of air traffic controllers who had been briefed to treat her flight as a routine military exercise. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah approached the first major checkpoint, a mountain pass that would take her across the border into disputed territory. Intelligence reports suggested enemy radar coverage in this area was minimal, but the terrain itself posed significant challenges. Peaks rose to over 12,000 feet on either side of her flight path, creating natural barriers that could hide her approach but also trap her if discovered. As she descended to follow the terrain contours, Sarah activated her aircraft's terrain-following radar system. The computer began automatically adjusting her altitude to maintain a constant distance above the ground, allowing her to fly at extremely low levels while avoiding obstacles. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, racing through mountain valleys at 300 miles per hour with only electronic sensors preventing her from flying directly into a cliff face. The weather was beginning to deteriorate as predicted. Clouds gathered around the mountain peaks, and Sarah felt the first hints of turbulence that indicated the approaching storm system. Visibility was steadily decreasing, but, for now, that worked in her favor by providing additional concealment from ground-based observers. 40 minutes after crossing the border, Sarah's threat warning system activated for the first time. Her instruments indicated radar signals from an enemy air defense installation approximately 15 miles to the east. The signals were weak and intermittent, suggesting her low altitude and the terrain were successfully masking her presence, but they reminded her that she was now operating in actively hostile airspace. Sarah adjusted her course slightly to maintain maximum distance from the radar site while continuing toward the target area. Her fuel consumption was higher than planned due to the low-altitude flight profile, but she still had sufficient reserves to complete the mission and return to friendly territory. As she approached the search area, Sarah began monitoring emergency radio frequencies, hoping to detect any transmissions from the missing generals. The modified communication equipment in her aircraft was more sensitive than standard military radios, capable of picking up weak signals that might indicate survivors attempting to make contact with rescue forces. At first, she heard only static and the occasional transmission from enemy search teams coordinating their ground operations. The voices were speaking in a language Sarah didn't recognize, but their professional tone and frequent radio checks suggested well-organized military units actively searching the same area where she hoped to find the generals. Then, just as she was beginning to wonder if the generals had survived the crash at all, Sarah detected a faint signal on one of the emergency frequencies. The transmission was brief and heavily obscured by static, but it followed standard NATO distress protocols. Someone was alive down there, and they were trying to make contact with rescue forces. Sarah circled the area where the signal had originated, using her aircraft's sophisticated electronic equipment to triangulate the source. The terrain below was heavily forested with numerous small clearings that could serve as potential landing sites. However, most were too small or too steep for a fighter aircraft, even one piloted by someone with Sarah's skills. On her third pass over the area, Sarah spotted something that made her heart race, the reflection of metal among the trees, partially concealed by camouflage but visible from her aerial perspective. It was the wreckage of the general's aircraft, scattered across a small valley and partially hidden by the canopy of pine trees. but there was no sign of the survivors themselves. The distress signal had come from approximately 2 miles northwest of the crash site, in terrain that appeared even more challenging for potential landing or extraction. Sarah needed to establish direct communication with the generals to assess their condition and determine the best approach for rescue. Using her modified radio equipment, she began transmitting on the emergency frequency where she had detected their earlier signal. Eagle Solo calling Alpha Team, she said, using code names established during her mission briefing. Eagle Solo calling Alpha Team, please respond. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, but then, Sarah heard a voice that was unmistakably American, though weak and strained. Eagle Solo, this is Alpha Team, the voice replied. Thank God you're here. We have 2 wounded, limited mobility, and enemy search teams approximately half a mile from our current position. Sarah felt a surge of relief and determination. The generals were alive, but their situation was clearly desperate. Alpha Team, this is Eagle Solo. I need your exact coordinates and assessment of injuries. Also, can you reach a suitable landing zone for immediate extraction? The response took several minutes, during which Sarah maintained a wide orbit while continuously monitoring for enemy aircraft or surface-to-air missile threats. Eagle Solo, we are at grid coordinates. The general provided precise location data that Sarah quickly plotted on her tactical display. General Hoffman has a broken leg and possible concussion. General Rossi has severe lacerations and suspected internal injuries. We cannot travel far without assistance. Sarah studied the terrain around their position and realized immediately that a conventional landing was impossible. The area was too mountainous, too heavily forested, and too small for her F-16. She would need to find an alternative approach. Alpha Team, I cannot land at your current position. Can you move approximately 1 mile southeast to grid reference? Sarah provided coordinates for a small clearing she had identified during her reconnaissance. It's the only location in the area suitable for aircraft landing. The pause before the general's response told Sarah everything she needed to know about their physical condition. Eagle Solo, movement to that position would be extremely difficult given our injuries. We would need at least 2 hours, and enemy search teams are active throughout this area. Sarah found herself facing exactly the kind of decision that had led to her grounding weeks earlier. Standard protocols called for her to coordinate with backup extraction teams and wait for conditions that would allow a safer rescue operation. But the generals were running out of time, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly as the storm system moved through the area. Looking at her fuel gauges, Sarah realized she had perhaps 30 minutes of flying time remaining before she would need to begin her return journey. Not enough time to coordinate with backup teams, but possibly enough to attempt something that no pilot had ever tried before. The idea forming in her mind was either brilliant or completely insane. The terrain around the general's position included several extremely small clearings connected by what appeared to be old logging roads. None were large enough for a conventional landing, but they might be sufficient for a different kind of approach. Alpha Team, I'm going to attempt a touch-and-go extraction, Sarah transmitted. I cannot land fully, but I might be able to get close enough to the ground for you to board the aircraft during a very brief stop. The silence on the radio lasted so long that Sarah wondered if her transmission had been received. Eagle Solo, that sounds extremely dangerous for all involved, came the eventual response. Alpha Team, it's dangerous, but it's also your best chance. Enemy search teams will find you within hours, and weather conditions will soon make any extraction impossible. Sarah was already beginning her approach toward the clearing closest to the general's position. The area was barely 200 yards long and perhaps 50 yards wide, far too small for a normal F-16 landing, but potentially workable for what she had in mind. Her plan required precise timing and perfect execution. She would approach the clearing at minimum safe speed, use her aircraft's drag chute and reverse thrust to slow down as much as possible, and hopefully come to a brief stop that would allow the generals to climb aboard before she had to take off again to avoid overshooting the available space. As Sarah began her descent toward the clearing, her threat warning system suddenly came alive with urgent alerts. Enemy radar installations had detected her low-altitude approach and were attempting to lock onto her aircraft with surface-to-air missiles. The storm that was supposed to provide concealment was also creating atmospheric conditions that made her more visible to certain types of radar. Eagle Solo, we are tracking multiple enemy search helicopters approaching your position from the east. The general's radio transmission was now urgent and filled with background noise that suggested they were on the move. You have approximately 10 minutes before they reach this area. Sarah's approach to the clearing became a race against time and enemy forces. She had to land, pick up the generals, and escape the area before either the helicopters arrived or the surface-to-air missiles found their target. The clearing rushed up toward her as Sarah fought to control her aircraft in increasingly turbulent air. Wind gusts from the storm were making precision flying extremely difficult, and the trees surrounding the landing area left no room for error. At the last possible moment, Sarah deployed her drag chute and activated reverse thrust, feeling her F-16 decelerate violently. The aircraft touched down hard and bounced twice before Sarah managed to bring it under control. Trees flashed past her wingtips as she struggled to stop within the limited space available. The F-16 came to a shuddering halt less than 50 yards from the end of the clearing. Sarah had perhaps 90 seconds to get the generals aboard before she would need to begin her takeoff roll to avoid enemy detection. Through her canopy, Sarah could see two figures emerging from the tree line, both men moving slowly and, obviously injured, but determined to reach the aircraft. General Hoffman was being supported by General Rossi, despite the Italian officer's own significant injuries. Sarah quickly opened her canopy and began reconfiguring her aircraft's seating arrangement. The F-16 was designed for a single pilot, but emergency modifications allowed for a second person to be secured in the space behind the pilot's seat. Getting two injured men aboard would require creative solutions and considerable discomfort for everyone involved. The generals reached the aircraft just as Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors in the distance. Enemy search teams were approaching faster than expected. Quickly! Sarah shouted over the noise of her idling engines. We have maybe 60 seconds. General Hoffman, despite his broken leg, proved remarkably agile as he climbed into the modified seating area behind Sarah's position. General Rossi, weakened by blood loss and internal injuries, required assistance from both Sarah and his German colleague to get aboard the aircraft. As Sarah secured both generals as best she could in the cramped space, her threat warning system began screaming alerts. Enemy helicopters were now close enough to pose a direct threat, and surface-to-air missiles were being prepared for launch from multiple locations. Hold on tight. Sarah warned her passengers as she slammed the canopy shut and pushed her throttles to full power. The F-16 leaped forward, accelerating down the narrow clearing as trees blurred past on both sides. Sarah could see the end of the makeshift runway approaching rapidly, and she knew this takeoff would require every bit of skill she possessed. At the critical moment, Sarah pulled back on her stick and felt the aircraft lift off just as the trees gave way to a steep valley. Behind them, she could see enemy helicopters arriving at the clearing they had just vacated. But the escape was far from over. Enemy radar installations were now tracking her movement, and she could see missile launches from multiple ground positions. Sarah threw her aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers while trying not to injure her already wounded passengers. Eagle Solo, this is Alpha Team, came General Hoffman's voice through the internal communication system. Outstanding flying, Captain. Now get us the hell out of here. Sarah smiled grimly as she dove her overloaded F-16 toward the valley floor, using the terrain to mask her escape route while enemy missiles exploded harmlessly in the mountains behind them. The most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. She had successfully rescued the generals, but now she had to fly an overloaded aircraft through hostile airspace while enemy forces mobilized to intercept her escape. The storm that had provided initial concealment was now becoming a serious threat to flight safety. Visibility was near zero, wind shear was becoming severe, and ice was beginning to form on her aircraft's surfaces. Sarah's fuel situation was also becoming critical. The extended time spent searching for the generals, combined with the fuel consumption required for evasive maneuvers, had reduced her reserves to barely sufficient levels for reaching friendly territory. As she flew deeper into the storm, Sarah realized that the most challenging phase of her mission was still ahead. Getting the generals aboard had required skill and courage, but getting them safely home would require something even more difficult: perfect navigation through impossible weather conditions while evading enemy forces that were now fully alert to her presence. The radio crackled with enemy communications as search and intercept operations expanded across the entire region. Sarah was now the target of a massive manhunt, flying an overloaded aircraft through dangerous weather with 2 injured passengers whose lives depended entirely on her ability to navigate challenges that would test every skill she had ever developed as a pilot. The storm had transformed from Sarah's ally into her greatest enemy. What had begun as convenient cloud cover was now a wall of turbulence, ice, and zero visibility that threatened to destroy her aircraft as effectively as any enemy missile. Ice crystals formed on her canopy faster than her defrosting systems could clear them, and wind shear threw her F-16 around like a toy. Behind her in the cramped passenger space, both generals endured the violent flight in stoic silence. General Hoffman had lapsed into semi-consciousness due to his head injury, while General Rossi maintained alertness despite obvious pain from his internal injuries. Sarah could hear their labored breathing through the internal communication system, reminding her that time was running out for her passengers as well as her mission. Enemy radio traffic had intensified dramatically since the rescue. Sarah's aircraft was now the target of a coordinated search involving multiple air defense installations, fighter aircraft, and ground-based radar systems. Her escape route took her through mountainous terrain that provided some protection from detection, but also limited her navigation options and forced her to fly dangerous low-altitude paths through the storm. Eagle Solo, how much further to friendly airspace? General Rossi's voice was weak but determined. Sarah checked her navigation display, calculating their position against known enemy air defense coverage and her remaining fuel reserves. The numbers were not encouraging. Approximately 45 minutes at current speed, sir, she replied. But we may need to reduce speed due to weather conditions, which could extend that time significantly. What Sarah didn't mention was that her fuel situation had become critical. The extended search time, evasive maneuvers, and now the additional weight of 2 passengers had consumed more fuel than originally planned. She might reach friendly territory, but landing would require finding the nearest available airfield rather than returning to her original base. As they flew through a particularly violent section of the storm, Sarah's threat warning system detected radar signals from enemy interceptor aircraft. Despite the weather, enemy forces were launching fighters to search for her escape route. The storm that hindered her visibility also affected enemy pilots, but they had the advantage of knowing the local terrain and operating from nearby bases. Contact bearing 270, approximately 20 miles, Sarah announced to her passengers. Enemy fighter aircraft searching our general area. Sarah altered course slightly to avoid the approaching aircraft while maintaining her escape trajectory. The change took her through an even more mountainous region where peaks rose above 10,000 feet on both sides of her flight path. Flying at low altitude through such terrain and near zero visibility required absolute trust in her navigation equipment and split-second reflexes to avoid obstacles. The first enemy fighter passed approximately 5 miles to the south without detecting Sarah's presence. But her relief was short-lived as her radar warning receiver detected additional aircraft approaching from multiple directions. Enemy forces were conducting a systematic search pattern designed to cover all possible escape routes from the rescue area. Eagle Solo, I'm picking up radio chatter suggesting enemy forces have identified our general escape vector, General Hoffman said, his voice stronger now despite his injuries. They're concentrating search efforts along the mountain passes leading to friendly territory. Sarah realized that her original escape route was becoming increasingly dangerous. Enemy forces were predicting her likely path and positioning interceptors to block her advance. She needed to find an alternative route that would avoid the concentrated search efforts while still allowing her to reach safety before her fuel ran out. Studying her tactical display, Sarah identified a possible alternative that would take her further north through even more challenging terrain. The route would add approximately 15 minutes to her flight time and require navigating through a mountain pass that was notorious for dangerous weather conditions, but it might allow her to avoid the main enemy search effort. I'm adjusting our course to avoid enemy concentration areas, Sarah informed her passengers. This will take us through more difficult terrain, but it's our best chance to reach friendly airspace undetected. The new route took Sarah's F-16 into the heart of the storm system. Wind speeds increased dramatically, and ice accumulation became a serious threat to aircraft control surfaces. Sarah found herself fighting constantly to maintain heading and altitude as the aircraft was buffeted by turbulence that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. During one particularly violent gust of wind, Sarah's aircraft was thrown nearly inverted before she could recover control. The maneuver put tremendous stress on both the aircraft structure and her injured passengers, but it also revealed something important: a brief gap in the storm clouds that allowed her to see stars for the first time since entering the weather system. Using that momentary visual reference, Sarah was able to confirm her navigation position and verify that her course correction was accurate. The mountain pass ahead was still shrouded in clouds, but her GPS indicated she was approaching the most challenging portion of the escape route. Eagle Solo, are you able to maintain control in these conditions? General Rossi asked, his voice reflecting concern about the increasingly violent flight. Yes, sir, but I need both of you to brace yourselves, Sarah replied. We're approaching a mountain pass that will require some very aggressive flying to navigate safely in zero visibility. What Sarah faced ahead was every pilot's nightmare: flying through a narrow mountain pass at high speed in weather conditions that made visual navigation impossible. The pass was less than half a mile wide in some places, with vertical rock walls rising thousands of feet on both sides. A navigation error of even a few hundred yards would result in flying directly into solid stone. Sarah's training had included extensive practice with instrument-only flying, but never under conditions like these. She would need to trust completely in her electronic navigation systems while maintaining the reflexes to react instantly to any changes in aircraft performance or unexpected obstacles. As they entered the mountain pass, Sarah reduced speed to the minimum safe velocity for her overloaded aircraft. Every second of flight time was precious given her fuel situation, but attempting to navigate the pass at higher speed would be suicidal in zero visibility conditions. Her terrain-following radar painted a picture of the landscape around them: vertical walls of rock passing just hundreds of feet from her wingtips, with the aircraft threading through gaps that seemed impossibly narrow for a fighter jet. Sarah's hands moved constantly on her flight controls, making minute adjustments to maintain centerline as wind currents bounced unpredictably off the surrounding mountainsides. Halfway through the pass, Sarah's threat warning system detected radar signals from an enemy aircraft approaching from behind. One of the searching fighters had either detected her presence or was following the same route through the mountains. The enemy pilot faced the same navigation challenges as Sarah, but he had the advantage of local knowledge and was flying an aircraft not overloaded with passengers. Enemy contact closing from 6 o'clock, Sarah announced. Distance approximately 8 miles and closing. Sarah could not increase speed without risking a catastrophic collision with the mountainsides, but she also could not allow the enemy fighter to achieve weapons range. Her F-16 was armed with air-to-air missiles, but engaging in combat while navigating through the mountain pass would be extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Instead, Sarah relied on her superior knowledge of the terrain ahead. Intelligence briefings had identified a side canyon approximately 2 miles ahead that branched off from the main pass. The canyon was too narrow for most aircraft, but Sarah's F-16 might be able to use it as an escape route that the enemy pilot wouldn't dare follow. As they approached the side canyon, Sarah made a decision that would have terrified most pilots. Without warning her passengers, she threw her aircraft into a knife-edge turn that took them directly into the narrow canyon at a 90-degree angle to their previous course. The maneuver was so sudden and violent that both generals were pressed against their restraints with crushing force. Sarah herself felt the beginning of blackout as G-forces peaked during the turn, but she maintained consciousness through sheer determination. The side canyon was even narrower than the main pass. In some places, less than 200 feet separated the rock walls on either side of her aircraft. But it also provided perfect concealment from the enemy fighter, whose pilot would not risk following them into such dangerous terrain. Sarah's gamble paid off. The enemy aircraft continued along the main pass, apparently unaware that its target had disappeared into the side canyon. But Sarah's problems were far from over. The canyon led in a direction that would take her further from friendly territory, and her fuel situation was becoming desperate. "Eagle Solo, that was some impressive flying," General Hoffman said, his voice indicating both admiration and concern. "But where exactly are we going now?" Sarah studied her navigation display, looking for options that would get them back on course toward friendly airspace. The canyon system ahead was complex, with multiple branches that could either lead to safety or trap them in a dead end surrounded by impassable terrain. "I'm navigating toward a valley system that should connect us back to our escape route," Sarah replied. "It's going to add some time to our flight, but it's better than engaging enemy fighters in a mountain pass." What Sarah didn't mention was that her fuel gauges now showed levels that were dangerously close to minimum reserves. Even if they successfully avoided enemy forces and navigated through the remaining terrain challenges, they might not have enough fuel to reach a suitable airfield in friendly territory. The side canyon eventually opened into a broader valley that allowed Sarah to increase speed and begin making up some of the time lost during her detour. But, as they emerged from the worst of the mountain terrain, new challenges appeared on Sarah's radar screen. Enemy air defense installations along the border had been alerted to her presence, and surface-to-air missile sites were actively searching for her aircraft. The missile systems were designed specifically to engage low-flying aircraft attempting to penetrate or escape through border regions. Sarah would need to use every electronic countermeasure available to her aircraft while maintaining the high-speed, low-altitude flight profile that had kept her hidden from enemy radar for most of the mission. But her modified F-16's countermeasure systems had limitations, and some of the more sophisticated enemy installations might be able to track her despite her defensive efforts. "Missile launch detected, bearing 090, Sarah's threat warning system announced in its electronic voice. Sarah immediately threw her aircraft into violent evasive maneuvers, launching defensive flares and chaff to confuse the incoming missile's guidance systems. The maneuvers were necessary for survival but consumed precious fuel and subjected her injured passengers to punishing G-forces. The missile passed harmlessly to the south as Sarah's countermeasures successfully confused its targeting system. But the launch had revealed her position to other enemy installations, and Sarah could see additional missile launches beginning from multiple locations. Multiple missile launches detected. Recommend immediate evasive action, her aircraft's computer announced with typical electronic calm. Sarah found herself flying through a lethal maze of surface-to-air missiles while trying to maintain course toward friendly territory. Each evasive maneuver was perfectly calculated to avoid destruction while minimizing fuel consumption and stress on her passengers, but the cumulative effect was pushing both her aircraft and her passengers beyond their limits. "Eagle Solo, how much more of this can the aircraft handle?" General Rossi asked, his voice strained from the violent maneuvering. "We're approaching friendly airspace, sir," Sarah replied while pulling her aircraft through another high G-turn to avoid an incoming missile. "5 more minutes and we should be clear of enemy air defenses." But Sarah's fuel situation had reached critical levels. Her gauges showed reserve quantities that might be sufficient to reach friendly territory, but landing would require finding the nearest possible airfield rather than attempting to return to her original base. As they crossed the border into friendly airspace, Sarah immediately contacted the nearest NATO air traffic control facility to declare an emergency and request immediate landing clearance. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle Solo declaring fuel emergency with medical casualties aboard," Sarah transmitted. "Request immediate vectors to nearest suitable airfield." The response was immediate and professional. "Eagle Solo, nearest suitable facility is Ramstein Air Base, bearing 075, distance 42 nautical miles. You are cleared direct approach, emergency vehicles standing by." Sarah calculated quickly and realized that reaching Ramstein would require every drop of her remaining fuel. There would be no margin for error, no second approaches, and no opportunity for anything other than a perfect landing on her first attempt. As her F-16 descended toward Ramstein Air Base, Sarah reflected on the mission that had begun with her grounding for reckless flying. The rescue had required exactly the kind of decision-making and risk-taking that military regulations were designed to prevent, but it had also saved the lives of 2 high-ranking officers whose loss could have triggered international incidents. The runway lights at Ramstein appeared through the clearing storm as Sarah configured her aircraft for landing. Her fuel gauges showed quantities so low that her engines might flame out before reaching the runway, but she maintained perfect approach speed and heading as emergency vehicles moved into position along the flight path. "Eagle Solo, you are cleared to land runway 07, the control tower transmitted. Medical personnel and refueling equipment standing by." Sarah's F-16 touched down smoothly despite her fuel situation and the challenging conditions. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, Sarah felt the engines flame out from fuel starvation, a reminder of just how close they had come to disaster. Emergency medical personnel immediately surrounded the aircraft as Sarah opened her canopy. Both generals were conscious and alert, though obviously in need of immediate medical attention for their injuries. "Outstanding work, Captain," General Hoffman said as medics helped him from the aircraft. "You've just completed one of the most extraordinary rescue missions in aviation history." As Sarah watched the generals being transported to waiting ambulances, she realized that her grounding for reckless flying had actually prepared her perfectly for a mission that required exactly those qualities that military regulations typically discouraged. General Hayes appeared at Sarah's side as ground crews began examining her fuel-depleted aircraft. "Captain Mitchell, I have a message from NATO Command," the general said with a slight smile. "Your unauthorized deviation from standard rescue protocols has been officially designated as innovative tactical adaptation under extreme circumstances. Congratulations, you're being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Sarah looked back at her battered F-16, its fuel tanks empty and its surfaces still covered with ice from the mountain storm. The aircraft had performed flawlessly despite being pushed far beyond its normal operational limits. "Ma'am, does this mean I'm no longer grounded for reckless flying?" Sarah asked. General Hayes laughed. "Captain, after tonight's mission, I think we need to redefine what we consider reckless. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a pilot can do is follow the rules when the situation demands creative solutions." As dawn broke over Ramstein Air Base, Sarah realized that her grounding had ended not with a return to routine military flying, but with a mission that would redefine her understanding of what it meant to be both a disciplined military pilot and an aviator willing to trust her instincts when lives hung in the balance. The rescue mission had proven that sometimes the best pilots were those who knew when to break formation, when to ignore standard procedures, and when to trust their hearts over their orders. Sarah had found the balance her grandfather had spoken about, knowing when to follow rules and when to follow something more important.